Hey there, this is Pinky, coming to you from the top of the Sears Tower in Chicago, Illinois. Bunny and I are here in Chicago to look for the 1893 Columbian Exposition. I mean, yeah, I know we're about 100 years too late, and of course the exposition is long gone, but that World's Fair was one of the most important events in the US during the late 19th century, and it had a profound impact on the course of American history. The fact that nobody seems to remember it, I mean, even most people who live in Chicago never heard of it, that only makes me all the more curious to find out how something so big and so important could have disappeared from public memory. Here we are, looking a bit southward now, and off in the distance, right there, that's where the Columbian Exposition was held, in Jackson Park. It was a huge event. Let's go see what's left of it. Let's see if any of it's still there. Okay, here we are in Jackson Park, and so far, nothing. It just looks like a regular park. But according to this history book, there's supposed to be a monument around here someplace. Okay, here it is, tucked away among a bunch of trees. It's not very big. It's a recreation of the gold-covered original that used to stand very close to this spot, in a giant-sized reflecting pool. There we go. You can see from this old photograph taken in 1893 that the original statue must have been more than twice the height as this reproduction one. See the little gondola with the tiny people in it near the bottom? Yeah, so the original would have been pretty big. This statue is named the Republic, and the Columbian Exposition was ostensibly held to commemorate the 400th anniversary of Columbus's discovery of the New World. So yeah, this statue, sitting in the middle of this quiet, empty park, marks the actual site of the Columbian Exposition's fairgrounds. More specifically, it marks the exact spot of the fair's administration building. Here it is. This is the administration building. It used to stand right here. Wow, look at all those people. Oh, here's a photo of the administration building and the statue in the pond. And this is the pond as it is today. Pretty different. Walking a short distance off, we now come to the south end of the exposition's main lagoon. Along the way, in 1893, we would have seen the very impressive canals, all lined with huge buildings that were built for the exposition. Before we go on, I think we should talk a bit about just how big the Columbian Exposition was. Over 630 acres. Over 200 buildings were constructed from scratch for the exposition, with many of them so large that they actually built buildings inside these buildings. The scale of the event can also be understood in terms of how many people attended. Consider this. In the 6 months that the exposition was open, over 27 million people attended. And that's at a time in which the entire population of the United States was only around 60 million. Can you imagine? Travel wasn't easy in those days. This is way before air travel, mind you. But people thought it important enough to get out there, to the Midwest, to Chicago, and see this amazing spectacle they called the White City. A very important aspect of the Columbian Exposition was its architecture. It was meant to be monumental and grand, a spectacular mix of European, classical, Renaissance styles. But the architecture wasn't only meant to be just aesthetically pleasing. The emphasis on drawing heavily from easily recognizable European models was also heavily symbolic. It was meant to demonstrate to the visitor, in no uncertain terms, that America was the direct intellectual and cultural heir to the best traditions Europe had to offer. And the over-the-top displays inside these impressive buildings were simply the other half of the message. Vast collections of the newest advances in technology, industry, science, agriculture, and commerce. The exposition was, in fact, a huge classroom, and the citizenry were the students. The lesson being taught was that America was the most powerful emerging nation in the world. Now, this idea of American supremacy, well, this argument was made at the exposition both directly and indirectly. The main area of the Columbian Exposition, containing the largest and most impressive buildings, occupied this area here. This area spoke directly about American progress, economically, politically, culturally, spiritually. But there was also another area of the exposition. This narrow area here, they called the Midway Plaisance. It was, in many ways, meant to act as a sort of polar opposite, an antithesis. The two areas worked together by providing a kind of compare and contrast. Whereas the exhibition halls were high culture and progress, the Midway was all guilty pleasure, full of beer, fighting, and exotic hoochie-coochie dancers. Civilization versus barbarism. Christianity versus, well, everything else. At the Midway, a wide selection of people, animals, and objects were presented for visitors to gawk at. Africans, Pacific Islanders, Arabs, Orientals, ostriches, and of course, Indians. Lots of Indians. The visitors were enthralled, so much so that, in many visitors' accounts, it was really the attractions at the Midway that provided them with the greatest pleasures and sense of astonishment. It was a rare opportunity for the American visitor to meet in live human diorama form all these hideously backwards people who seemed to exemplify and embody the exact opposite of what the United States aspired to become. Here it was, all laid out in front of them, in graphic and obvious terms, the differences between us and them. And through the lens of Americanism, these people must have appeared very, very inferior, and perhaps even very appropriate subjects for civilizing and spiritual rehabilitation, American style. Tens of millions of visitors experienced all this firsthand. They returned to their lives and jobs with a new sense of national pride and basically a new national identity. In classrooms, in parlors, in bars, on the Senate floor, people began speaking with more conviction of America's responsibility to exert its influence on a global scale. And of all the lasting legacies of the Columbian Exposition, I think this was its greatest impact. The sum total of all its various parts had the combined effect of narrating a compelling story of American superiority, and this narrative meshed quite nicely with the objectives of American politicians and businessmen who wanted the United States to extend its political, economic, and military power to the far corners of the earth. Together with other forms of coercion, most notably the sensationalistic yellow journalism of the day, the Columbian Exposition performed an essential task. It molded and shaped the public's imagination in such a way that the very idea of subjugating foreign lands and foreign people could be seen as natural. Now, a little context. We need to consider the Columbian Exposition in relation to the overall historical context of American territorial expansion. 100 years earlier, in 1783, we have a much smaller United States. Then we have the Louisiana Purchase, 1803, Florida, 1821, Texas, 1845, Oregon Country, 1846, Mexican Cession, 1848. Hey, the 1840s were busy years. Manifest destiny, you know. Gadsden Purchase, 1853, and Alaska, 1867, not on the map. By 1890, the American frontier is officially declared closed. And then comes a pivotal moment. Beginning in the 1890s, the exact historical moment in which we have the Columbian Exposition, the United States becomes an overseas empire by establishing colonial outposts in foreign lands. Hawaii, 1893, 1898, Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines, Eastern Islands of Samoa, 1900, Cuba, 1898, or 1902, depending how you look at it. Anyway, the point is, by taking foreign lands beyond its continental borders, the United States of America, itself built upon lands seized from indigenous peoples within its continental borders, had now begun a new phase of American imperialism that would define its foreign policy throughout the 20th century and beyond. Over the next 100 or so years, the United States would use its military all over the world to enforce its policy objectives again and again, not to mention even how our country uses its tremendous economic and political leverage to exert pressure on others without the direct threat of missiles or bombs. And this, you could say, brings us up to date to our current situation. So I guess that's why I wanted to come to Chicago. I thought that maybe by actually being here, being at this place that was so important in shaping the American worldview at that time, that maybe it would somehow help me to understand how the people of this nation somehow came to give their consent to empire building. I want to understand this because, well, we don't have World's Fairs anymore, but we do have other institutions that perform similar functions. Museums, schools, advertising, Disneyland, stuff like that. I think institutions like these tend to have a lot in common with each other in terms of how they work. And I figure by studying World's Fairs, sort of the granddaddy of modern propaganda forms, maybe one day I'll be able to see very clearly exactly how the ruling classes persuade the masses to see things their way. Today, the only building from the White City still standing is the old Palace of Fine Arts. It's since been converted into the City of Chicago's Museum of Science. The rest of the Columbian Exposition is long gone. So, what happened to all the other buildings, you ask? Well, to make a long story short, shortly after the exposition officially closed, there was a big railway strike in the city of Chicago, and in the ensuing rioting, pretty much the whole White City went up in flames. Whatever wasn't burned to the ground was demolished. The land was leveled, and in the coming decades, the area would be used for a bunch of different stuff. First athletic fields, then a US Army missile range, and then for a long period of time, it was just a big flat nothing with a lot of weeds. Now it's sort of a nature preserve. But within only a couple of generations, the whole World's Fair had quietly slipped into the dustbin of history. So that's basically how it all disappeared. It's hard to comprehend. The only signs that the thing ever existed are, well, signs. Innocuous, ugly little metal signs. It's beyond ironic that the most lavish and spectacular public event of its era would end up being remembered, barely, in the most banal way possible. But I think that's how history often works. I mean, things like this happen all the time. What happened here did matter, and we are still living the ramifications of this disappeared place.
In October 1890, a curious volume went on sale in the bookstores of New York. Called How the Other Half Lives, it had been written by a 41-year-old Danish-born police reporter named Jacob Riis. It would change forever the way people thought about the city. Riis had come to New York in 1870, when he was just 21, with $40 in his pocket. The money soon ran out, and he had learned firsthand what immigrant life could be like in the sprawling metropolis. Homeless, often hungry, and out of work, he had drifted into the crime-infested world of the 5 Points slum, dozing on the cold, filthy floors of police lodging houses. More than once, he considered killing himself. Eventually, he landed on his feet and managed to find work as a police reporter for the New York Tribune, and spent the next 10 years exploring the densely crowded slums of the Lower East Side. The sights, he later said, gripped my heart until I felt that I must tell of them or burst. Determined to show the world what he had seen, Riis began publishing magazine articles, but they seemed to make no impression, he wrote. He thought of taking pictures, but the tenements were too dark for the photographs to come out. Then, in 1887, a breakthrough came with the invention of a new photographic device, a magnesium flash powder that flooded even the deepest shadow with a brilliant flash of light. Armed with the new apparatus, Riis and his assistants plunged into the 5 Points.
With their way illuminated by spasmodic flashes, as bright and brief as those of lightning itself, a mysterious party has lately been startling the town. Denizens of the dives, tramps and bummers in their lodgings, have marveled at the phenomenon. What they saw was 3 or 4 figures in the gloom, a ghostly tripod, some weird and uncanny movements, the blinding flash, and then the patter of retreating footsteps, and the mysterious visitors were gone. The New York Sun, February 12, 1888.
They would go into places, especially at night, with the brand new flash powder attachment and surprise people, sleepers in these kind of collective sleeping rooms, or drinkers in these rot gut saloons.
The images Riis brought back brought wealthy and middle-class New Yorkers face to face with a reality most had long sought to avoid. Their city, one of the wealthiest in the world, had become home to more than 1 million overworked and undernourished people, often living in conditions of unspeakable horror. He went everywhere, carrying his camera down obscure courtyards and back ways, with names like Ragpicker's Row, Blind Man's Alley, and Bottle Alley. In a place called Bandit's Roost, he photographed a dozen men, all said to be wanted for murder. He was especially moved by the plight of the young, the ragged street Arabs who sold newspapers by day and slept in alleys by night. The child laborers who often worked 7 days a week in stifling factories and sweatshops. And the tens of thousands of abandoned and orphaned children who had been left to fend for themselves. But what horrified him most was the unspeakable conditions in which so many New Yorkers were forced to live.
You have a vast influx of new immigrant groups, so that whereas in 1860 it was essentially a city of small homes, by 1900 the most crowded neighborhoods in the world are in New York City, especially on the Lower East Side, but also in East Harlem. We have the rise of tenement housing, which is really worse than anything that was ever seen in the United States. And it's probably about as bad as anything that's ever been put up anywhere in the world.
A tenement, briefly defined, is simply a building that concentrates as many people into as little space as possible, with the lowest overhead costs for the landlord. The tenements began sometime in the middle of the 19th century, and there were no laws governing the tenement, so it really stuffed people into 6 or 7 floors of rickety walk-up, jammed into as many rooms as possible, many of which were interior rooms with no light of any sort or air.
I went up the dark stairs in one of those tenements, and there I trod upon a baby. It is the regular means of introduction in the old dark houses, but I was never able to get used to it. I photographed the baby, standing with its back against the public sink, in a pool of filth that overflowed on the floor. I do not marvel that 1 in 5 children in the rear tenement, into which the sunlight never comes, was killed by the house. It seems strange, rather, that any survived. Jacob Reese.
Many of the tenements were life-threatening, literally. That is to say that the threat of disease, infectious bacterial diseases like dysentery, for example, was always there, and epidemics could spread rapidly. The high death rate, the high sickness rate. This was the reality for many, many hundreds of thousands, millions of New Yorkers in any given moment.
Ill-fed and ill-clothed, packed into buildings with few sinks or toilets, and sometimes with no plumbing at all. Tenement dwellers were prey to every kind of disease: diphtheria, influenza, typhoid, pneumonia. Worst of all was the disease called the White Plague, tuberculosis. Every year, 20,000 new cases were reported in the slums. Every year, 8,000 people died of the disease.
July and August spell death to the army of little ones, whom the doctor's skill is powerless to save. Sleepless mothers walk the street in the gray of the early dawn, trying to stir a cooling breeze to fan the brow of the sick baby. There is no sadder sight than this patient devotion against fearfully hopeless odds. Little coffins are stacked mountains of the Charity Commissioner's boat when it makes its semi-weekly trip to the city cemetery. Jacob Reese.
How the Other Half Lives awakened New Yorkers to the condition of the poor, as nothing else had. It was a new way of seeing the world, a modern way, and Reese used it not only to underscore his outrage, but to spur people to action. The slums were not inevitable, he insisted. They had been built by men and women could change them.
One of the things that Reese is trying to do in this book, I think, is to get away from some of the older Victorian notions of poverty. Why are some people poor? Why do some people live in such terrible conditions? And his answer is more along the lines of a modern sort of environmental view of poverty. What he's basically arguing is that if people are going to live in these terrible tenements, if people are going to be deprived of the basics of light and air, decency, we can't be surprised if these people become criminals or depraved or alcoholics or what have you. So that there's a way in which Reese is, I think, the opening shot, if you will, or you know, the first chapter in a Reformed tradition. Because it was a book that made a lot of people want to get involved in improving life in the city.
Not long after the book was published, New York's energetic young civil service commissioner, Theodore Roosevelt, called on Reese at his office on Printing House Square. The writer was out, but Roosevelt left his calling card with a note on the back. "I have read your book," it said, "and I have come to help.